This lecture is designed to familiarize you with the 50-year evolution of today's global climate action. And you can see these on the slide here, which I will be returning to during the course of my lecture this morning. It will cover the events and not the critical role played by my longtime friend and mentor, the late Maurice Strong, who was responsible for so much of this 50-year program, for putting in place the institutional framework and for driving the thinking behind today's modern environmentalism. We'll cover Maurice in detail in a lecture in a few weeks' time. He is the inspiration for Sun X Malta. But the starting point is in the early 1970s, the birth of modern environmental thinking. It's when the UN convened its first Earth Summit in Stockholm in 1972, and you may have been following some of the 50-year celebrations of that summit in recent weeks. This massive global event was convened against the background of the Club of Rome's historic Limits of Growth report. That report defined planetary boundaries and the human action taken to breach them. This was also a time of growing environment-related challenges on the ground. I myself remember the pea soup fogs in Europe. As a student, we would have to walk from our hall of residence to our lectures, holding on to the person in front because you could not see further than the distance of the length of your arm. And that was in the UK in the 1960s. There were harsh droughts in Africa, grossly polluted rivers in the United States. It was a time of limited global tourism, with jet aircraft only recently introduced. And there were few, if any, environment or climate ministries. The first ministry was actually created in 1970 in the United Kingdom. Today, every country has a Ministry of Environment, and many even a Ministry of Climate. The 1972 Stockholm Summit had only one head of state in attendance, Indira Gandhi, Prime Minister of India and leader of the Group of 77, a powerful geopolitical coalition of the world's so-called developing countries. 120 countries attended the Stockholm event. It led, amongst other things, to the transformation of the UN Environment Programme, UNEP, to a permanent body, and the first based in the developing world in Nairobi in Kenya. It marked the start of most countries getting deeply into environmental issues. It produced a declaration with 26 key principles on the future of our planet, as well as some 250 areas for further action. And I repeat, it is the start of modern-day environmentalism. On the timeline, the next major event of a similar nature is the Rio Earth Summit 20 years later. And by the way, that's not a coincidence. You will see that there is a systematic approach to holding the big Earth summits, first 20, then 10. And now, if you look at the COPs and the UNFCCC COPs, because that's not the only COP in existence. COP stands for Conference of the Parties. So wherever you have a convention, like the Biodiversity Convention, you have a COP. But the climate has become such an important issue on our agenda that the climate COPs are seen almost in the same category as global environmental high-level meetings. And not surprisingly, because they're now attended by so many heads of state. Before the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, there had been a flurry of preparatory action. The UN system had created the Brundtland Commission in 1987, and that defined sustainable development under the leadership of Gro Harlem Brundtland, the Prime Minister of Norway. It basically said we should only use the Earth resources so as not to deplete them for future generations. Also, importantly, in 1988, the IPCC was established, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This was a science-based body created by Maurice Strong in the UN Environment Programme and the World Meteorological Organization, UNEP and WMO, the one dealing with environment, the other dealing with weather-related issues, to deliver periodic stock takings of the state of climate metrics, climate calculations, climate scenarios, and to deliver periodic science assessments independent of the politics. And at that time, the politics were very vitriolic, with climate change advocates and deniers fighting out the battle largely in the US and Europe. IPCC operates on cycles and has established scenarios to help keep on track for Paris 1.5. And as an aside, I'll come back on this in later lectures. I'm involved at this very moment in creating a tourism version of the IPCC, one that brings climate scientists and tourism experts together to do exactly the same for tourism. I'll come back on that. Rio itself had 120 heads of state and was the defining moment in today's environmental activist initiatives. It built the link between economic, social, and environment futures. It gathered more than 30,000 people. It was my first international environment conference. It was a fascinating experience, particularly given the range of interests that had gathered in Rio, from indigenous people to religious groups to local council NGOs, to the delegates themselves, and, as I said, 120 heads of state. That was the massive jump from the one head of state who had been in Stockholm 20 years earlier. It concluded that the concept of sustainable development was a fundamental core of human existence. It was an attainable goal for all the people of the world, regardless of whether they were operating locally, nationally, regionally, or globally. And that was one of the things that I took away from the Rio conference, that every local activity is unique. It's governed by the history, the culture, the psychology, the politics of the people in that locality. And every pathway to a sustainable future brings together these global principles that we're studying here with the local implementation. And that's a core message that I want to convey to you. One of the things that should be at the heart of all your thinking, the concept of local approaches. There are big global principles that we'll discuss during these lectures. But at the end of the day, when you go back home, you're applying those principles in a local context. And every one of you in this course has a me-shaped individual local context. And so the solutions will have to be solutions which work at the local level. The Rio Earth Summit produced a whole raft of new framework initiatives. Agenda 21, a 21st century agenda for planet and people and other species. And in your background papers, you'll find an Agenda 21 for travel and tourism. More on that later. It produced the Rio Declaration, again, another 27 principles for sustainable development, building on the principles that had been established 20 years earlier in Stockholm. It produced the UNFCCC. We think of this now as it is, as an institution, but it stands for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's a convention, an international treaty, which had to be taken back and ratified by national governments. And the treaty only came into effect in 1994 when it had achieved sufficient ratifications. And 1994 is the birth of the international climate movement. The Convention on Biodiversity was another output of Rio, dealing with all the issues related to the animal kingdom. Kyoto Protocol. This is a very, very important development. Why? Because it was the first agreement to limit greenhouse gas and to give birth to the concept of national commitments, i.e., it was the responsibility of individual nations to take control of their greenhouse gases and to report on this back to the central body, the UNFCCC Secretariat, annually. It was also the birth of the concept Common but Differentiated Responsibilities, CBDR. And this is the most important principle on which climate discussions take place. What does it mean? CBDR. It means we have a common challenge. We have a common responsibility to deal with climate change. But we have differentiated responsibilities as well, because some people are the biggest polluters. Some people have created 99% of the problem, and others, particularly the developing states, are the victims. They're the ones who have created and are creating the least greenhouse gases, but in many cases, excuse me, they're the ones who suffer the most. The small island states in the Pacific, the emerging states in Africa, the states of Latin America. All of these are areas who have not been creating greenhouse gases, but they're the ones who will suffer the most. And incidentally, many of them are also the tourism-centric states. They depend on tourism for their economic development. Moving on, 2000 saw the Millennium Development Goal. 8 goals focused on poverty reduction and strengthening the least developed countries. MDGs were focused on the developing states, and they had a timeline to 2015 to achieve their objectives: halving poverty, reducing childhood diseases, ensuring education for all. These kind of framework goals were pursued over the next 15 years. But almost immediately afterwards, there was another Earth Summit in 2002 with Rio Plus 10 in Johannesburg. This was again focused on poverty, but it had a greater engagement of civil society. It was more people-focused than planet, and not surprisingly, because it was interlocked with the MDGs. And again, it was a summit that I was attending, this time as Assistant Secretary General of the UNWTO. The previous one I'd attended as the President of the WTTC, the first President of the WTTC. This one had a greater tourism engagement. In Rio, I was one of a handful, maybe half a dozen tourism people, most of them local from Brazil or from Latin America, attendees at the summit. There were no tourism issues under discussion in Rio. But by the time we came to Johannesburg, tourism had secured a small place inside the tent, so to speak. And indeed, the Secretary General of UNWTO was even given the opportunity as a head of a UN agency, because before 2000, UNWTO was just WTO. And it came into the UN system during the early part of this century. And that's when tourism began to get a position within the UN framework. Moving forward, we saw Rio Plus 20 in 2012. It recognized that the inclusive green economy is an important instrument towards achieving sustainable development. The idea of green growth was the dominant issue during that summit. It also produced hundreds of voluntary agreements to build sustainable development and green growth. This was the summit where stakeholders finally came into their own. And through the concept of voluntary agreements, it produced a raft of cooperation and collaboration between the public and the private sector, between the private sector itself, and even involving the NGOs. The Big Bang came in 2015 with both the SDGs and the Paris Climate Agreement. The SDGs are 17 areas covering the future of everything, with 169 targets and 200 plus indicators. They build on the MDGs, but they go further. And they're covering advances not just in developing countries, but in the developed nations as well. The SDGs are a global, inclusive framework. The SDGs take over where the MDGs had finished. And the MDGs framework was 2015. This was the start of a new, broader framework. But at the same time, you had in Paris actually COP15, a massive climate agreement. And this was the first time in Paris when the world agreed on a target temperature increase goal of no more than 2 degrees and ideally 1.5 degrees over the traditional pre-industrial temperatures. That is, the temperatures which prevailed basically before the 19th century. And that has become the holy grail of the climate movement. We have to restructure and reframe our global way of life so that our temperature does not increase more than what in 2015 was no more than 2 degrees, but what has increasingly become 1.5 degrees limit. At the same time, there was a landmark agreement on developing financing in Addis Ababa, which was going on at about the same time as the Paris Agreement. And there the government sought to provide some support for the transformation of the developing countries, the ones who had not created the problem but were the first victims. Moving along, last year, we had the famous Glasgow COP26. We had COPs every year from Paris to Glasgow, but Glasgow, with all the razzmatazz and PR that the British government were able to bring to bear, and they're pretty good at that kind of stuff, produced the first tourism declaration organized by UNWTO and UNEP and a civil society group called Tourism Declares. And we will see at COP27 in Sharm in Egypt in a few weeks' time, there will be an even stronger or continuing build-up of tourism engagement. And I mentioned before, but I'll just say a little bit more now. That's where you will see the launch of the TPCC, which your two lecturers of this morning, Susan Beckham and Daniel Scott, and I are spearheading to create an IPCC science-based body for tourism. And it will be one of the first sectoral bodies of its kind, and it is being backed, supported by the Sustainable Tourism Global Council in Saudi Arabia, where I'm an envoy of that council. And this is a project that we set up in the council, but it's designed to be launched, funded for its first 3 years, and then it's on its own. It's set up deliberately as an independent body, and the people involved wanted this for it to be credible, and so did the STGC and the government of Saudi Arabia, who we discussed the creation of such a body in some detail with. So there you have it, 50 years of environmental and especially climate policy development. What have we learned? A few things. Climate is now globally recognized as existential. Adverse climate impacts are more and more evident. Third, there's been an accelerating worldwide engagement, driven very much by the commitment and the anger of young people that this challenge, which was established 50, 100 years ago, has not been adequately addressed. We've learned that adaptation, which is resilience, and mitigation, which is greenhouse gas reduction, these are the 2 UN buzzwords, adaptation for resilience and mitigation for reduction. They're in play everywhere. Every government, every major industrial sector, including tourism, are focused on these 2 issues, albeit, in my view, too weakly at the moment. We've also learned that declarations are easy, but putting action into play is much harder to do. IPCC says we have to peak emissions in 2025. We have to halve them by 2030, and we have to achieve net zero by 2050. And we'll have a lot more to discuss about what net zero means in future lectures. Suffice it to say here that I'm in favor of absolute zero, real zero, not some nebulous form of offset supported continuing emission process. And how many self-declared authoritative studies will you find which ignore the 2025 target and make strong commitments for 2030 and 2050? I would say pretty much all of them. The industry is, however, committing to net zero 2050 and to halve it in 2030. And this is going to be a very important part of our future lectures. I want to thank you for your attention today, and I'm happy to answer any questions on today's lecture. As always, you'll find the lecture on the Thinkific platform, and you'll also find a significant amount of support material in the form of easy-to-watch videos and also base documents, which, if you have the time and the inclination, you will want to look at to get a more thorough vision of what is going on over this 50-year period. Thank you.